Welcome to Musings from Arledge. I have with me one of my favorite people in the world. We've known each other a very long time. He's been on here before. I'm going to introduce Rod to you, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're going to talk about. I'm excited about today's conversation. I think it's important and interesting. Let me start with my guest. My guest is Rod McNeill. Rod was a tailback at USC in the glory days of John McKay era. Rod was, recruiting was different in those days, but Rod would have been a five-star recruit the way we talk about it now. Probably the top running back recruit in the country. He set all kinds of records. Big guy, ran hurdles, and came to USC with a lot of acclaim. Had a successful career at USC, although injuries were a problem. We talked about that last time. Played on the 1972 national championship team, where he was a big competitor, big contributor, and of course the '72 team, according to a lot of people, including Keith Jackson, was the best college football team of all time. Played in the NFL some, and is genuinely one of the best, most decent, humble people that you'll ever meet, and a heck of a singer. Hey, Rod, thank you for joining again. I appreciate it.
Hey, Chris, I'm very, very happy to see you again and conversation because I know it's going to be exciting. You'll probably ask me questions I don't have answers to, but I'll make up something.
Good. That's what I want. Make up something interesting. That's all anyone cares about. All right, let's talk about what we're going to discuss today. So this past summer, former USC fullback C.R. Roberts passed away. And Roberts had an important place, not only in Trojan lore, but also, I think, in the history of race relations and the end of segregation in this country. And so Rod and I have been talking for a few months about having a discussion about C.R. Roberts and also Sam Bam Cunningham, a very good friend of Rod's, who, of course, had a very famous day in Legion Field in Alabama. And then talk more generally about some of the Trojans that have had a significant impact and the courage it took to do what they did and why we should remember them today. I want to start with this, though, because I know that there are some people listening to this show that are familiar with these stories and familiar with the issue. I also know that there are people who are not. And to a large extent, I miss this period of time. My earliest memories are from the late '70s. And in the late '70s, my family lived in the San Francisco Bay Area. My dad was a pastor of a church. Rod and his wife, Pam, were members of that church. And I had a very different view of race relations growing up where I did, when I did, than a lot of other people did, because that was a church that was not just integrated, but a church where it was very racially diverse and the people genuinely loved one another and socialized together. And so it was years later when I actually learned that that's not necessarily the way things had always been in this country, or were still in some places. And so part of the reason I want to talk about this today is because I want people to understand the history of both USC football, but also the history of these guys who made a difference. So let's start with C.R. Roberts, since he was really the impetus to starting this. Rod, what can you tell us about C.R.?
Well, Chris, I have to tell you, I was really impressed when I met CR because, again, everyone who is part of the Trojan family is always welcome to be at Trojan events, and CR was one of the people that would always be present, but not necessarily trying to take the limelight. He was always present, but in the background, and you look at him and wonder, who is this guy? Generally, there was somebody who would say, "Oh, that's C.R. Roberts. This guy set a record against Texas for rushing." And you go, "What?" And this is what 1955, I think it was. So it's like, oh, I wasn't even alive. I was barely alive when he was doing that. I had no idea that USC had that kind of history, and that's something that I think the Trojans could probably take advantage of because of the fact that USC has always been aggressive relative to being progressive in terms of what's happening in society and just really doing things that are right for the country, right for the school, and right for the community that they're part of. And CR was that kind of person. He had a family who was constantly supporting him, always willing to share stories about what he went through, and also players who were always willing to support him, which is another key part of this whole story that needs to be uncovered. Which I mean is, what I mean by that is, CR probably played with maybe two or three other black players on his team, but the white players supported him like he was one of the guys. So that is a key thing too. I think is important for his success and how he was able to continue to add to the Trojan legacy. And you and I were speaking earlier, and that legacy goes back a long way, even to what the early 20s, uh, with some other players that SC's had. So I think makes me proud when I hear about how CR went down there and did a great job, really playing to the point where he effectively minimized the great Texas team and really just, I think he exceeded his own expectations in terms of what he accomplished that day. But he went on from there to just continue to be a humble person who always extolled the values of USC and the importance of teamwork, and which is very similar to Sam Cunningham that we mentioned.
So let's set the stage a little bit. USC is going to play Texas. It's 1956. At the time, Texas is segregated by law. I mean, it's not just that Texas doesn't have black football players.
Mhm.
It's that by law there's segregation throughout, right? In the schools, the
Mhm.
restaurants, the hotels. In fact,
Right.
USC had to go to three different hotels until they found one that was willing to break the rules and allow USC's two black players to stay with the team. That, by the way, says something too, right? I mean, it would have
Mhm.
been an easier thing, the wrong thing, but for USC to stay in a hotel, find alternative accommodations for two of its players. But to their credit, I assume it's the coach, the athletic director involved in this. USC refused to do that, and they finally find a place where that's willing to break the law for USC to have their players there, essentially. Now, if you're CR Roberts, that's a difficult situation, right? I mean, your team is trying to find a place to stay. You know that the reason that they can't is because you and one of your teammates are not wanted in Texas, and they're not wanted in that location. And what do you make of that, Rod? I mean, if you're CR Roberts, how does that make you feel, and what are you looking for from your coaches and teammates at that point?
Well, that's a wonderful question actually, because it really takes me back to living in North Carolina and being born in 1951 in Durham. That was a place also where, not necessarily by law, but it was definitely part of the history of the state, that black people and white people did not mix. And in fact, my neighborhood was 100% black. Hardly ever saw anyone who was white other than on television. So, but I mean, life was good. We had our own people there, and we all enjoyed each other. And it really became, I think, interesting and challenging more as we started to integrate, because then people started to protect what was theirs and not necessarily wanting to change the culture. But I know CR is just like me and lots of other black people. He was a person who was in a unique and challenging situation, one that was even life threatening. You could say, and he was supported by non-African American people, basically white people, who said, "Hey, we have to do the right thing in this situation," and that was true in my life as well. As we grew up in North Carolina, moving to California, we always had people who knew what the right thing was and were willing to step out and really ruffle the feathers of the community and the society and at large in order to move forward with what was the correct posture and correct thing. So I know in CR's case, he had some death threats for just riding on the bus with the team. So that was uh, something he had to consider. Do I go out there and play, and or do I just sit back and wait till we get back to California? And clearly, CR said, "I'm not just going to play, but I'm going to dominate," and that's exactly what he did.
Yeah, I think to the tune of 251 yards and 3 touchdowns, and he didn't even play
Yeah,
all that much. I mean, he did that damage in a very short period of time.
right, exactly, exactly. And then you talk to people about him, and they'll talk about his incredible abilities. And he was not necessarily a big guy. He's probably about 5'10", 5'11", and obviously had physical capability, very fast and very athletic. But he was really an excellent player and had a chance. And that's one of the things about being a place like SC. You can be an excellent player and have great skill, but on the platform where you get to demonstrate that, it's not always easy. But you have to be in a mindset that says, I can overcome whatever is involved in this situation. And CR was that kind of person.
Yeah. It's interesting because you talk about this and you think, and when we talk about Sam Bam uh, and Alabama in a minute, there's a statement that I had heard about that game that makes you think that maybe some people are overstating the importance of these events. But here's the thing. You have to understand just how important football is and was in the state of Texas or in the state of Alabama, right? I mean,
Right.
this is not a minor thing. This is something that the entire state takes deep pride in. And
Mm-hmm.
whether or not the Longhorns or the Tide are winning football games is something that means, frankly, a whole lot more to people than it probably should, right? I mean, it's hugely important.
Yeah.
So, so in many respects, this is the stage that matters, right? I mean, it would be one thing you have a really good black doctor who treats some white patients. I don't know if that has the same impact as C.R. Roberts going out on the field in Austin against Texas in front of a whole state that loves football almost more than they love anything, and
Mm-hmm.
watching him completely dismantle their team, right? I mean, that's meaningful, isn't it?
Well, of course it is. I mean, you think about, I mean, it probably speaks somewhat negatively to our society in that we're willing to put players and athletes and actors and people who are able to do the extraordinary, we put them on our pedestal and we really come to a point of worship. And so when you take a guy who's not even part of the pantheon of gods and you put him in a successful situation where he kind of demonstrates the abilities that are present in all the people that are, part of his race. And that I hope I'm not speaking too uh, uh, candescently. I mean, I really just want to point out the fact that he had an opportunity to not just elevate himself, but to elevate his people. And so that's a big thing on your shoulders. And he carried that very well. And he did it all the time. That's, again, part of the wonderful story about CR is he carried that wherever he went and in every situation that I was able to see him in. I did see him quite a bit because he was around SC quite a bit. And that's, I think, another thing that USC needs to include in that recruiting process, keeping the players who've done it, been involved, actually come up through the history of the school because the history is so rich. It's so rich.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And it's not just the history of national titles and Rose Bowl wins. It's this sort of thing that and
Hmm.
and and one of the reasons I wanted to do this is because whenever we talk about the USC football heroes of the past and you talk about the Marcus Allens and the Ronnie Lotts and Rodney Peete and whoever, the names of the guys that went out and performed well on the field, C.R. Roberts is a guy that I think gets left out of that, probably unfairly. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts on why that is, because I don't think that's true of Sam, right? I think that we'll talk about Sam in a minute, but Sam's story is one that I think does get a lot of traction. It is talked about a lot, and rightfully so. But C.R. Roberts, not as much, and I'm not sure I understand why. But I wanted to try to correct that a little bit today. Any
Yeah.
idea why Sam's story is so famous and C.R. Roberts' story is not?
Yeah. Well, I would say if we look at the situation, the setting, the time frame, I mean, CR was at the beginning of that history, and that's when we go back to the early 50s. Our country was really involved in some very unique struggles across the board. We were, coming out of World War II, uh, looking at a situation where people were starting to awaken to some of the uh, things that were going on in our society that were, you know, flat out wrong, criminal. And people really were starting to look and change. So in CR's case, it probably points more to I think the national shame that was underlying what was going on in those cultures. I mean, and the lynchings going on, families being displaced, uh, property being taken, so many things that were negative that basically happening from my perspective from a misguided feeling that everything had to be protected because there wasn't enough. In this country, there's plenty for everybody, but I think there was an attitude of we can't allow certain people to succeed because it's going to be detrimental to the race itself. Then Sam's situation, I think we're going to see that that attitude had changed significantly. Again, if you look at the historical backdrop, you had the Vietnam War happening. You had young people coming up with a whole different way of looking at things, a different perspective. The flower children's, for example. But there was a lot of discussion and attitude change going on at that time. So I think Sam was riding the tide of that, whereas CR was doing really more brick breaking and wall breaking than Sam was, even though they were both doing the same thing. Whereas Sam had the tide of what was happening in the country behind him. CR was really kind of out on the island, really at that point where, his life could have really been in danger. I don't think Sam ever felt like his life was in danger.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know.
So in fact, since we're talking about guys who are out on an island, but before their time, maybe, let's talk a little bit about Brice Taylor. Because Brice Taylor played at USC in the 20s, right? I mean, this is well
Yeah.
before there's a civil rights movement, and was an All-American in 1925. Look, you came to USC some 45 years after Brice Taylor. Uh, did you have any sense then that what Brice Taylor had done was important to you, and now looking back, do you have any sense that what Brice Taylor did was important?
Well, at that point, when I actually met him on campus in a couple of recruiting trips, but nobody told his story. It's like, oh, this is Brice Taylor. He's a Trojan football player. And you look at the guy, and he's smallish,
Yeah,
like weighed like 165 pounds, played guard for USC, and had been a track star as well as football, played tennis, and I mean, he was an incredible individual, and he had one hand. He only had one hand. People don't realize that.
hmm.
He was a running back originally, and they moved him to guard when he made All-American at 165 pounds. So you see him hanging around, and he's got that same attitude that CR and Sam have, that unassuming, uh, not braggadocious, very quiet, just confident. Right? He wore that confidence, like Sam and like CR, that confidence that comes from deep within, and that is born on the wings of those people who've gone before, who said, okay, we've got to do something about this situation. We got to get in there and not just do well for ourselves, but for our people. And, Bryce carried that as well. And I remember meeting him on a couple of occasions and really just wanting to know more about him, but that wasn't something that was going to be readily available. And I'm glad when I heard we were going to have this discussion, I looked into what he had done and what he accomplished. And it really speaks well, again, of the history of USC and our willingness, USC's willingness to bring people who may be controversial into the fold and allow them to have an opportunity. And that is the history of USC. And that's something, again, is very important that new recruits and the players who are there now understand that being part of USC is really being part of a really big thing for our society.
Let's talk then. Let's talk about Sam Bam in Alabama. And I think a lot of the people that are listening to us probably know some of this story because it is a famous story. Um,
Mhm.
but I think you have a special insight here because you were a part of the program at the time and were very close with Sam for, well, throughout his entire life. I mean, you guys were best friends or close to it, right? And so let's start with this. As somebody who knew and loved Sam for a long time, tell us, what should we take from Sam Bam's Alabama story? What somebody like me, somebody listening to this program, what should we take from this? What's meaningful about it?
Well, I think I'll compare it to, some of the players we see today who are having great success, and African American players are having great success today, both in high school, college, and in the NFL. Great success. And I think a lot of times the attitude that we see displayed in response to that opportunity that they've had and their ability to take advantage of it, it goes a step beyond where I think they're a little bit more voracious in terms of eating up that opportunity and giving back what I say is really a negative picture to what it means to have had an opportunity and to succeed at it. Where Sam was absolutely the opposite. And I would say that about CR as well. I mean, both of these guys bounded into national prominence by what they accomplished, by what they suffered, and what they endured, and what they accomplished in a very difficult situation. You have to remember, Sam was only a sophomore, and in those days, freshmen couldn't play varsity. We had to play with the freshman team for games. But when we became sophomores, Sam was pushed into the limelight. One, because he was an incredible athlete. Truly, I mean, he was even looking at being a decathlete in track because of his great abilities. But the thing that was so amazing about him was his incredible uh, confidence, one, and two, his humility. And nothing fazed him as far as, when good things happened to him, and when he was able to contribute in a way that made a change for the team. And it's something that everybody around him recognized. And I recognize it deeply because he and I were somewhat on the same path. We competed in track against each other and just really became really good friends. And, I think friendship is something Sam he brings with him when he's part of the picture. He just brings that because of how he feels about people. And, he doesn't force himself or didn't force himself on me, but he created an air of, I need to know this guy because what he has is something I need. I need that ability to remain humble. I need that ability uh, to produce, to give everything I have in every situation. And that's, I think, one of the key factors that Sam had. And we go back and look at some of the films, what he was doing when he was a sophomore and all throughout his career at USC and even in the pros, he did everything, he gave everything he had on every play. And that's, I think, what really was the thing that made him great. A lot of people don't know how to do that, but Sam knew how to do that and remain one of the most humble people I've ever met. So, and then to do that in a historical way, meaning that it impacted history, the history of our country, so significantly. And it's a tribute really to the sport of football, which I love because of what it was a vehicle that really changed our society. It really was, and it's changing it more today. And that's why it's kind of frightening to see what's happening with the whole NIL situation. Players opting out of games because they're concerned about their futures. Like, well, hold on a second. If you really want to opt out, maybe you shouldn't have played football in the first place. Pick a whole different field.
Yeah.
Right. So I think we have a lot of things going on that threaten the sport, and that could be the ultimate end of the sport itself because of the things that it has accomplished. And now we're almost at an epic epicenter, or that's at the top of where this whole thing can go from a financial standpoint, and where egos are going, and where players are responding to the success they've had. I mean, it's like taking something that uh, intrinsically had a good thing about it, because it taught players how to endure hardship, how to overcome adversity, how to work together as a team, regardless of who the people were you're playing with, regardless of what their race was, and really create brotherhood and camaraderie. And I think the sport now, if you look at the transfer portal, and they expect two guys to bring in a brand new team, and then somehow to adhere together and become supportive of each other to the point that you really become brothers. They may talk about it, but I don't think it really is happening. And that to me threatens the very essence of what college football is about anyway.
So
Yeah.
I want to ask you about that coming together as a team thing, because I don't think I've heard this from you. I've heard it from others who may or may not know what they're talking about. But what I had heard was that in 70 and 71, there was real division in the USC team. Some of that may be racial division, some of it otherwise. And it was really in 72 where the team comes together as people, right? They come together and decide to work together, that what was already an immensely talented group then takes off into the stratosphere. Is there truth to that?
There's no doubt. There's absolute truth to that. And in fact, I'm involved with some of those players from that team. We have a Bible study that we participate in weekly. That's really led by Dave Brown, who was one of the catalysts on that team. Who you know he had become a Christian, and he saw the need. Actually, went to Coach McKay and asked if he could have a Bible study with the guys weekly and before the games. And Coach McKay, which surprised me, agreed to allow him to do that. And that was clearly one of the things that transformed that team, which had similar talent. Similar talent. We look at the years from what 69 when I got there, 70, 71, and then 72. The talent was very similar, if not more talented, over the previous years. But then culminating in that 72 team as having this great talent and also great brotherhood, great camaraderie, and overcoming our sense of self so much. You know what I mean? So yeah, that it was significant, and I think what Dave did with his courage and willingness to go and talk to Coach McKay, and Coach McKay's courage and willingness to say, okay, I'll take a chance with that and see what happens, because it could have been disastrous. The
Yeah.
press could have gotten hold of it, or it could have aroused some feathers by other players, but it became it broke down some barriers, and it kind of focused on, hey, what does it mean to be a teammate? What does it mean to be a brotherhood? And that is so strong for that team. It's so strong and still exists, even though we've lost quite a few of the players. That the overall attitude from that team still exists today.
Yeah, one of the things that's great about football, especially probably all team sports, but football because the amount of pain involved is that you learn to overcome you learn to work hard now for what you hope will be some sort of future payoff, which may or may not come, and you learn to deal with adversity. But that's on sort of an individual level. I love that about football, but that's on an individual level. But the other thing is that football's a sport where you can't help but work closely with other people, right?
Right.
Basketball's a team sport. But in basketball, you can have one dominant guy that kind of does his own thing and scores 40 points and leads you to victory. That doesn't exist in football, right? I mean, in football, you have to work together. I remember both Bill Bradley and Jack Kemp, two very well-known politicians from, I don't know, 30 years ago or so, one Republican, one Democrat, but both were professional athletes, and both commented separately about how they actually learned how to get along with people who were different from them,
Mhm.
racially and in other ways, by playing football and playing basketball. That's where they learned that. And one of the valuable things it seems to me about sports is you are thrown in there with people who may be very, very different from you, and you either
Mhm.
figure out a way to understand them and care about them and work with them, or you fail, right? Those are really your two options. And that's one of the great things about it. And I think those early 70 teams are at USC are a great example of that, right? If when when the guys weren't willing to work together, they were 6-4-1, despite the fact that they were better than a lot of those teams they were losing to. And when they figured that out, the team took off like no college football team before, probably.
Yeah, absolutely. That's true. And part of that, that realization that at the core, we all had the same desires and dreams and the same needs, the things that we had to have that we wanted to accomplish. Coming to that realization it's definitely an eye opener. And you either can, like you're saying, you can either accept complete failure because you can't overcome your own attitudes, or you say, is there a value in my accepting this person for who they are? And that comes from both directions. And I think the ultimate question, the answer is yes, there is value in that. And the value is so great, it transcends how good of a football player you are and it becomes how good of a person, how good of a human being you are. And that's the ultimate goal, I think, of sports is to transform us into somebody who is more than the actual sport itself and makes us a better person. And that's the ultimate goal.
Yeah, that makes
But
sense.
that's the part that concerns me. I think we're losing that part of it. You
Yeah,
know, I do.
yeah. No, that I mean, it certainly look. It never made sense for college football to generate billions in revenue and the players not have enough money to get a pizza at night, right? That never made sense.
Yeah.
So I'm glad that we're seeing changes. It never really made sense to me that players are stuck at the first university they sign up at, no matter what they were told, no matter whether their coach leaves, right?
Uh,
That never made sense to me either. And so I think the changes are important and necessary. But you're
mhm.
right. You're right that I think that we're risking, maybe we've already lost it, but we're at least risking losing something important where
Yeah.
it comes down to how much money is this guy going to give me, and
Yeah.
if I'm not happy with what's I didn't get the ball enough here, so instead of working hard this off season and trying to get better, I'm just going to jump in the portal and disappear somewhere else. I do
Yeah.
think we're losing something important.
And I think, as we get down the road a bit, we're going to go back and look at some of the stories that didn't work out well. And I think it'll paint a different picture than what we think we're seeing. And it's probably going to be tragic because I really think the impact on sport in general I don't know how we recover from it. I don't know how we get back to the pure essence of what it really brings.
Yeah. Yeah,
So
and frankly, even at the high school level now, you see what amounts to these super teams, right? Mater Dei and St. John Bosco and Bishop Gorman.
yeah,
These are IMG Academy. These are super teams. These aren't the neighborhood kids. These are
right,
guys from everywhere. They're playing on TV just about every night. They're flying all over the
right,
country. Um,
yeah,
that's a different high school experience than I had, or I think that you had. We had
right,
different high school experiences because I was a pretty good high school football player and you were a superstar. But despite that, um, the guys that we were playing with, these were the guys from our neighborhood, and you had
right,
on your team just whoever lived in that area, and you were gonna, and it's not like your guys would disappear and they would go to a school,
mm,
20 miles down the street so they could play on a super team. I mean, you had who you had, and you went to battle with those guys.
yeah, yeah, and that's a whole different kind of brotherhood, right? And the little guys you grew up with versus somebody who's bust in every day. Is you don't have a chance to develop the kind of deep relationships that
Yeah,
we have previously. So that makes it even more difficult when you think of how you get back to just being a neighborhood team. That may not be able to happen. So it just might
yeah.
be the elite playing with the elite, and we have to take for what it's worth. You know.
Yeah, and by the way, I don't mean to trash those programs. I know that those programs they have great coaching, they have great facilities, they develop
Yeah.
guys. I get all that. But there's something about being a 4 or 5 star recruit and playing with 30 other guys who are going to be 4 and 5 star recruits. There's something different
Yeah.
about that than, for example, I remember seeing this. I remember seeing this show on Troy Aikman. Obviously Aikman was a superstar in high school, but they had no
Mhm.
talent on that team. It was Aikman and then a bunch of guys smaller than him. I think they won 2 or 3 games his senior year. Um,
Uh,
I suspect Troy Aikman learned more that senior season in football, going through what he had to go through, than he would have if he
mhm.
signed up with a bunch of other guys who were superstars and they went 13-0 and won CIF because they were just better than everybody. There's something
Yeah.
about having to struggle. There's something about having to struggle with guys who are trying their best and they're not very good, and you have to be there to
Mhm.
pick them up. There's something about that that's meaningful, and I do fear
Yeah.
that in Southern California, at least at the high school level, the best players are missing out on
Mm. Yeah, you really make a good point there. And I think, like you said, it's starting to get rid of that whole concept because it's so effective in terms of building great players. I think they have to turn the corner and make sure what's included in that process is, making good people,
that.
focus on, what's at the core of all this. And the important aspect is how do we make better people who survive the football, the athletic aspects, and can then contribute to society in other ways.
Yeah,
And that's the thing that has to be done. You have because there are so many guys who, fall by the wayside, that they come out of the whole thing broke, no education, injured. And so much of that story we don't hear anything about.
yeah,
And we have to make sure that that's, we're lifting those guys up as well.
yeah. Well, and this is a good point because I had mentioned earlier that you were a superstar in high school, and you were, but the truth is, no matter who you are, maybe with a couple of very rare exceptions, almost no matter how good you are going eventually, you are going to struggle. And you had your struggles at USC, well, the shattered hip, and all of a sudden you go from Heisman candidate to guy who can't walk. I mean, obviously that's not something you wanted, but I
Mhm.
suspect that's something you learned from immensely. And you went on, you played in the NFL for a few years, but that's not where you were successful. You became successful in life because of the lessons you learned along the way. No doubt from your parents, but also from playing football and from the struggles you went through. I mean, that stuff's important, isn't it?
Well, yeah. I mean, I could say, no, it's not as important as winning the Heisman Trophy, but in actuality, it really is way more important. And, you know, and sometimes I feel like I'm kind of kidding myself when I say, well, Rod, if you won the Heisman, you probably would have been a horrible human being. Sometimes I kid myself and say, I probably could have been okay with the Heisman. I probably would have been a good person anyway.
I'm
But
willing to try it. Yeah,
but I just know that there's so many times that I've met people who allowed their success to dominate their personalities, to dominate who they were. And frankly, they're not really that nice a person. They're not that kind of a human being that I aspire to be.
yeah,
And so yeah, you're right. It's a difficult situation, but if you really look at it honestly, and what are the rewards? And what are the ultimate goals that you have as a human, as a person who loves God and loves his fellow man? Then yeah, and those you can definitely make an argument for, keep the Heisman and give me character, and I'll take that.
yeah. So there's earlier we had talked about the celebrity culture and how American society tends to worship the athletes and the entertainers, the people who have sort of extraordinary opportunities and sometimes have extraordinary skills and maybe put them on a pedestal that we shouldn't. But I think the
Hmm.
C.R. Roberts and the Sam Cunningham stories also point to something else that's important because if you go back and read what C.R. Roberts uh, uh, said about that trip to Texas, he talked about how, and this I'm sure is an exaggeration, but he says just about every black person in Austin shows up to the hotel the USC is staying at so that they can
Hmm.
meet C.R. Roberts and his teammate because these are guys who are they're staying in the White Hotel. They're going to play football against Texas at that stadium against a completely segregated Texas team. And for people who grow up in Texas in the 30s, 40s, 50s, who don't have the opportunities to do what they were capable of doing, this is deeply meaningful to them, right? I mean, it's meaningful enough that you have Texans and Alabamians coming up and cheering on these USC players because they're breaking through these barriers that people hadn't been able to
Hmm.
break through. I mean, that's almost an example of, in one sense, that's an example of celebrity culture, right? Because it's a star football player. That's why I go shake his hand. But
Right.
really, they want to go shake his hand because he's doing something meaningful to them, right? Something that
Mhm.
that they had dreamed about doing, that their parents had dreamed about doing, that hadn't happened, and now they're seeing it take place, right? That's meaningful, isn't it?
Of course it is. I mean, and we've had an opportunity to actually talk to people who lived in Alabama when we were down there playing uh, football with Sam. And they're people who were kids when that was going on, and now they're adults and they look back on what happened. And to them, it's almost like dreamlike, a dreamlike state where, like the white knight comes in and slays the dragon and everybody's free and happy. But it really is that kind of an attitude where somebody who, against indescribable odds, things that they've seen their other relatives, their fathers, their cousins, their brothers, the uncles had been just wiped out or prevented from having any dreams really about how life could be and relegated to just menial tasks and hard labor. They actually saw somebody come in and say, "No, this is not the reality. The reality is you can accomplish these things. You can have dreams. You can have accomplishments that exceed your imagination." And that's what Sam and CR and Bryce, all three of those guys, had that kind of experience. And that history is real. That history is out there, and that will never, ever be able to be put aside and minimized. It's incredible. And the thing that I have to keep harping on is they did it. All three of them did it, and with great humility, without stepping on people's toes or pointing fingers or being angry about the lack of publicity they got or the lack of endorsement money or whatever. They did it purely out of something deep within themselves that said, this is the right thing to do. and this is the right attitude to have about that success. And that to me, I think is far more important than any amount of trophies or awards or cash or whatever.
Yeah.
Just have that feeling.
So one of Bear Bryant's assistants made the comment later that Sam Cunningham did more to integrate Alabama in 60 minutes than Martin Luther King Jr. did in 20 years. That's an exaggeration. That's not true. But he is recognizing that there's something really groundbreaking about what happened on Legion Field that night, which is why people are still talking about it. They're making shows about it. And what's interesting to me is if you'd ever had the opportunity to meet Sam, and I did on a number of occasions. I didn't know him as well as you did, obviously, but that may make it even more striking because if it's one of your buddies, it's hard to be arrogant and better than you if it's your buddy that you've known for 50 years. But I met Sam. He didn't know who I was. I didn't mean anything to him. And you wouldn't find a guy who is more down to earth and friendly and humble, despite the fact that he was a superstar in college, a great pro player, and somebody who people are still saying things like that about his impact. Despite that, you walk away from him and your impression was not, this guy must have been an amazing football player. Your impression is, that's a really good dude. And that was the impression every time I saw him. And so it wasn't an error. It's not something he was putting on. That's who he was.
Right. And that's I tell a story too, how I go visit Sam in his neighborhood. He was like one of the neighborhood watch guys. And I mean, he treated everybody in his neighborhood the same. He was like king of the neighborhood, but occupying the role of king, which meant he had responsibility for the whole neighborhood. And he really did. He looked out for the animals, the cats, the dogs, the children, the postman coming by. I mean, he just immersed himself in service to his fellow man and service to those around him. And I think that was probably the core of his humility, was he really felt like it was important to be a public servant and truly serve his fellow man.
All right, let's close with this, Rod.
Okay.
Because most of the younger guys, whether, guys that are playing at USC now or high school players or junior high players, look, if you turn on the television, you watch Texas or Alabama play, it's unimaginable that those schools would have all white players, right? That's not exactly the way it is now. These guys weren't alive then. They didn't see these games. They didn't live through what CR and Sam and Bryce lived through. But if you could tell those guys, the young guys today, the guys that are coming up, they're playing football, they want to go and be NFL stars. If you could tell them something about CR and Sam and Bryce, the lesson they should take from those guys that they should take forward with them, what would it be?
That's a very good question. I would think, I would say, look at life as an opportunity to exceed your expectations for yourself and look around at what the average person is doing. I mean, most people don't come anywhere close to having a chance to reach their dreams. I mean, they're so stuck in your day-to-day activities, just day-to-day trying to survive. But if you look around, there are ways that you can change your situation. And if you're fortunate enough to have that experience, just remember where you came from and remember the responsibility you have to those around you to lift them up out of the situation that they're in. And I think that would be the most important thing I would say about that.
Good. I love it. That's a good place to end. Rod, as always, I appreciate you being here. It's always good talking to you, and especially on this topic. I hope people get something valuable out of this. I think they will. All right,
I hope
friend.
so, Chris. It's always a pleasure. And I just want to say, hey, tell your dad I said hi, that I love him.
I'll do that. All right, my friend.
All right, take care.